certainly bring it back. Yes.
That would be great. Thanks.
Thank you.
And our clerk will be keeping track of all of the written questions, so we'll be following up with those. We will now move to Mr. Melillo, who will have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here on this important discussion. Just want to quickly ask, I guess, a higher level question in terms of the process of coming to this legislation. Could you speak to, and for anyone who could speak to it, the consultation process and how this was developed, if there were perhaps either some other proposals or suggestions to how this could be brought forward throughout that process, and what led you to the framework that exists today?
Thank you for the question. I'll start, and then I'll turn to my colleague, Isabel Cantal, to answer that question. I think, this was the result of a convening of many partners to try to address what was considered a national emergency, which remains a very urgent matter about the overrepresentation of Indigenous children across the country. And for further details, I'll turn to Isabel.
So thank you very much for this. Yes, indeed, the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada in 2019 called an emergency meeting where Indigenous partner provinces and territories were all gathered together to assess the fact that there was an overrepresentation of children in care. During that meeting, there was an agreement that 6 points of action were developed and were going to be enforced. One of those points of action was the creation of a legislation that will allow Indigenous groups to take care of their children. So with that commitment and desire of fulfilling that point of action, Department of Indigenous Services Canada met with over 2,000 Indigenous people, let it be elders, youth agencies, communities, provinces and territories, to gather their views on what would that look like. I think that the engagement process of the development of C-92 is really a co-development process, and it led to what is now the Act.
Okay, thank you. And just quickly, just with limited time, will the ruling itself, the Supreme Court ruling, or the process of getting to the ruling, how does it impact not only this legislation, but perhaps future legislation?
I can turn to my justice colleagues. I think it's difficult to speculate, but I'll turn to them for comment.
Can I just clarify in terms of your question? Do you mean in terms of the consultation and cooperation process?
In terms of the Supreme Court process and the ruling that came of it.
How will it influence future legislation? That is really difficult to speculate. The court was, as I mentioned before, the court was very careful to stick to the nature of this legislation, the affirmations made within it. But it did affirm that very positively that this kind of legislation was within federal legislative jurisdiction. So, I think that's what we can take from the decision.
So thank you very much. Thank you for those answers. And just very quickly, Mr. Chair, while I have the floor, I'd just like to give notice of a motion. I want to be clear, I'm not moving the motion. I just want to provide the notice for it while I have the opportunity. And simply the motion would be as follows. Given that First Nations and Inuit police services do important work to keep members of the communities they serve safe, that in the opinion of the Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs, these police services provide an essential service and should be declared essential, and that this be reported to the House. That's the entire substance of the motion. Mr. Chair, I'd just like to briefly speak to it as well, and why I'm bringing it forward. Obviously, First Nation and Inuit police services do provide essential services for the residents that they serve. The government has, in the past, spoken about the need for legislation to ensure that there's proper designation of them as essential. But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, that was promised in 2022. 2 years later, the government still hasn't acted on it.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in. We are straying into the kind of out of what's allowed right now.
Okay.
You were doing the notice of motion. Now we're getting into debate on the motion, which, because it's not in order at this point, I'd say we probably shouldn't be going there. There'll be time to debate it when we get to it.
Understood.
You still have about 40 seconds on your questions if you want to go back to that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Just say I look forward to having a more wholesome discussion on that motion at the appropriate time, and I hope I'd be able to get support from colleagues across the table on that, as it is very important to people across the country and to First Nations and Inuit in particular, that unfortunately we've seen tragic circumstances as a result of this underfunding and lack of proper funding from the federal government. So I think I've exhausted my time there, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. We will now go to Mr. Batiste, who will have 5 minutes.
Yes, you had mentioned the Supreme Court introducing this notion of legislative reconciliation. And specifically, the court noted, and this is the court's words, not mine, is that reconciliation is a long-term project. It will not be accomplished through a single sacred moment, but rather through a continuous transformation of relationships and braiding together distinct legal traditions. And we had talked a little bit about what UNDRIP, what this could possibly mean for the future. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about how can implementation of UNDRIP contribute to resolving issues surrounding the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care?
Maybe I can speak to it generally, and then my colleagues from Indigenous Services can speak to the program. So the UN Declaration has been described as a framework for reconciliation in Canada, and the court references that in their decision, and as I mentioned earlier, speaks really highly of this legislation that Parliament passed. It talks about legislative reconciliation as an enactment of legislation to respect, promote, protect, and accommodate inherent rights through mechanisms of frameworks elaborated upon within the statute. And so when they looked at the construction of this statute, particularly recognizing the jurisdiction of Indigenous governments and the really essential character of the relationship between parents and children and families and communities, and how essential that healing is and having some autonomy over those relationships is to reconciliation. So the court certainly does consider all of those different aspects of law and the UN Declaration in particular in reaching its opinion. But in terms of the program itself, I don't know if my colleagues want to add.
Thank you for that. And I think, really the purpose of the Act is to further UNDRIP's, purpose as well, which is really to ensure that decisions that are made about the most important relationships are made by the people who are directly affected by them, which is Indigenous communities themselves. So the purpose really being to reassert jurisdiction where it has been for thousands of years, and for that support to be a bit different than what we've seen historically in child welfare, to really be prevention-based and to be strengths-based in terms of what a community has to offer its children.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the map that was handed out here. I noticed that there's a lot of different provinces and territories that are on here. As someone who's from Nova Scotia, I'm noticing that Nova Scotia is not one of those with a dot, as well as Nunavut. And so I'm wondering if we can speak to why is there seemingly no active update or progress happening in those two areas?
Thank you for the question. I think it really does depend on which communities want to do what when. And the Act is one tool. There are many tools in terms of what communities are already actively doing. So if you don't see something on the map right here, it doesn't mean that there's not change happening in terms of child and family services. And I would say I work on the Act side. My colleagues who work on the program side have seen many, many changes, particularly Mi'kmaq, Nova Scotia, around preventive care, around rethinking what exactly they're trying to do. So I do think that what you see here is a partial representation of the overall area of work that's happening. And we always go at the pace that communities wish to proceed.
And so just to be crystal clear on this, the money that's, I think it's more than $40 billion that's out there, Nova Scotia, despite having their own Mi'kmaq family child and family services, will be eligible for all of the money that's, well, not, a portion of that money that comes from this will actually be going into Nova Scotia, correct?
Certainly, absolutely.
Okay. So in my last bit of time, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Jordan's principle. And there's a lot of discussion around some of the delays that have been, that are out there. I'm wondering if the department could talk a little bit about concerns about the delays in processing Jordan's principal claims and what this could possibly mean moving forward, and so how are we remedying these delays or what is seen as non-action?
Thank you for that question. We do work alongside colleagues in Jordan's Principal. It's not our area of work. I do understand, and we'll get you a written answer to that question, but I do understand there's been a significant increase in requests as communities understand better what's available under Jordan's Principal, and that there's active work being undertaken to address any delays. But we'll provide you with a written answer on that question. Thank you.
I'm good.
That time. So we have time for one more round of 15 minutes, so it'll be 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 2.5, 2.5. And with that, we'll jump right to it with Mr. Shields going first for the Conservatives for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just going back to the information that, just to clarify, and I appreciate the information you've given us, you've got 7 coordinated agreements have been signed. Can you define what a coordinated agreement is?
Yes, so a coordination agreement is basically an agreement about the assertion of jurisdiction and what the community is going to do, what are the funding frameworks that are built therein. And basically, it's the tripartite agreement that exists to support the exercise of jurisdiction by a given Indigenous community.
3 parties are at the table then.
Yes.
What's the provincial role in this agreement?
Well, you can imagine typically over the years, and I think you mentioned this earlier, provinces have been very active in providing child and family services, particularly off reserve, and it's a coordination, right? Like the title sort of gives it all, right? It needs to be a coordinated a coordination of services across those areas, so that, for example, if a child is living off reserve, but a community has a sort of jurisdiction over, a whole geographic area, then those 2 areas have spoken to each other, and there is a plan about what is going to happen to support that child and that family. So all those pieces are built into the coordination agreement. There's an incredible amount of planning, which is part of the reason why it's time-consuming.
So that would lead me to believe then that the provincial organizations still have a large role to play in the enactment of these agreements.
In terms of like the planning, yeah, absolutely. We think that the tripartite role is very important.
Once it's implemented, though, let's talk about in the sense of when we're talking about nations and the services that they may provide on their nation, but they may be looking to contract outside of their nation. Is the province involved in that, in your opinion?
In terms of what agreements that may exist after a coordination agreement's been signed, that certainly depends on the given Indigenous governing body and how they've developed their model. It'll depend from case to case.
So the latitude could be for a variety of them, that the First Nation may have an agreement with the province to contract or to an independent contractor?
Both are certainly possible.
So the provincial organizations we see now, which can be fairly extensive as this program has been in place for children for a long time, they could still have a significant role?
Well, I think you're putting your finger right on it. It's a different role in terms of where the jurisdiction lies and also where the decision-making lies. The decision-making, when jurisdiction's been assumed, lies with the community. What the different vehicles that may be necessary to, for example, provide an emergency service in a city, that is for the community to determine and may involve contracting with a provincial body. However, the decision-making process lies with the community.
So the ultimate decision is with the nation that signs that agreement, in your belief, because you haven't got an agreement signed at the end yet.
There are 7 that exist now.
Coordination agreements, but
That's
you
right.
haven't signed off on a final agreement with anybody yet.
No, there are 7. Those 7 to which I'm referring are finalized. And there are nations that are exercising jurisdiction. Yes.
So 7 coordination agreements have been signed. So
Yes.
when I asked you earlier, are there any in place that actually, and I thought I got the answer no.
Oh, I apologize if I spoke that way. No, what I mean to say is that there are 7 Indigenous governing bodies in Canada that are exerting jurisdiction over their child and family services. Yes.
Which is what I thought. So your answer confused me.
I apologize.
So what is the monitoring mechanism for those agreements? Is there any role of monitoring, or now are they standalone? Are they separated totally from the federal government and provincial, they're making the decisions totally?
Well, it is a self-governing agreement, so the decision-making process, as in any self-government, would rely with the community. Yes.
Okay. So that process has happened. 7 are totally independent, those nations making decisions on child welfare. So how long is that first one? How long have these 7 been in place?
Since